said at the beginning, makes huge improvements to the way in which the government delivers social housing, and I commend it to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Call Phil Twyford.
Mr Speaker, first let me begin with some comments generally about the Minister's stewardship of the housing portfolio. Two words come to mind: utter shambles. We've seen in the last few weeks and the last few days, sir, one after the other, aspects of the Minister's portfolio that are in absolute disarray, and the most recent are the loan-to-value ratio spending limits, where it's blatantly clear to everybody that the government has mismanaged the portfolio and this issue. They failed to take into account the impact on first-home buyers. They failed to consider that it would depress new builds and the imperative of increasing supply. And they failed to properly consider the implications for provincial New Zealand. House prices in Auckland, the most overheated property market, 17.9% up over the last 12 months. In Canterbury, the government's in denial. They insist there is no housing crisis in Canterbury when people are paying hundreds of dollars a week to live in sleepouts and caravans, and rents are up 25% in the last year. Government agencies are routinely referring people to live in campgrounds, and interest rates are heading north of 10%. Those are the true key performance indicators of Nick Smith's stewardship of the housing portfolio. There are numerous problems that are out of control, and the Minister behaves like a jack-in-the-box, popping up every few days with the media in tow to announce the fitting of a new door handle on some house somewhere around the country. He is desperately trying to convince the New Zealand public that the government is not to blame for the housing crisis, and he's running around like a jack-in-the-box, desperately trying to convey the impression that the government's got a handle on the housing crisis. Well, sir, this bill that we're debating this afternoon is more busy work from the Minister. He won't do the obvious thing in the worst housing crisis, the worst housing shortage in living memory. He won't do the obvious thing and increase the amount of state and social housing. All he's willing to do, sir, is shuffle the pack. That's all he's willing to do. Now, let me explain, sir, that only 4% of the New Zealand population are currently housed by state and social housing. Only 4%. That is woefully low by international standards. It is. It is. The Minister is shaking his head, but he knows I'm right. What does this bill do? It shifts housing stock out of Housing New Zealand's hands into the community housing sector. Something that I will go on to explain. Labor is perfectly comfortable with in principle and accepts all of the key arguments why it's a good thing for New Zealand to grow and empower the community housing sector. But this Minister insists on slicing up the pie in different ways, but he utterly refuses to grow the pie. Secondly, he wants to make all State House tenants subject to insecurity of tenure. And again, we'll talk in more detail about this. But all State House tenants under this legislation will be subject to reviewable tenancies. Instead of building more state and social housing, the Minister wants to more ruthlessly move tenants through those properties. He is only shuffling the last few cards in the pack. That's all he's doing. He refuses, or perhaps it's his cabinet colleagues that he's been unable to convince, but they absolutely refuse to consider actually increasing the stock of social and state housing. Mr Speaker, Labor will not vote for a bill that gives Nick Smith the power to throw 80-year-olds out on the street because there simply aren't enough houses. We will not support it, even though there are some aspects of this bill that we support. The fundamental objection we have is that this bill gives Nick Smith the power to throw 80-year-olds out on the street because there aren't enough houses, and that, sir, is politically and ethically bankrupt. We believe, Mr Speaker, that this provision in the bill will create needless stress, anxiety, and, as expert submitters told the Select Committee, will actually pose a public health risk by piling on needless stress and insecurity and anxiety on some of the people who are least able to cope with that. Only the National Party would announce with great pride and fanfare in the budget speech that their goal, their objective, is to kick out 3,000 State House tenants out of their houses. That is the National Party's idea of a state housing policy. I want to quote the Productivity Commission, because that organisation is that minister's touchstone. It's that minister's touchstone. It is the organisation, their report, the Productivity Commission on affordable housing, is the Bible that Nick Smith reaches for whenever he's in doubt. And I have referred to them in this House as ideological dinosaurs, because I believe that is what they are. But I'm going to quote it, because the Productivity Commission is Nick Smith's Bible. And on this issue of reviewable tenancies, this is what Nick Smith's intellectual mentors had to say. They said that moving people through state houses on the basis of reviewable tenancies undervalues the stability needed for sustainable improvements in social outcomes. Social housing is best thought of as a contribution to a complex set of social needs that typically occur in clusters. The current approach to reform, that is, the imposition of reviewable tenancies, is not always in harmony with the desires of communities for stability and continuity, which are often essential for addressing the needs of families requiring social assistance. Well, Minister, I suggest you go back to your intellectual mentors at the Productivity Commission and consider for a moment what they have to say about one of the most important provisions in this bill. They do not support reviewable tenancies. They are advising you to do the opposite of what you are doing in this bill. Yes, they are. I want to refer to the submission from an excellent organisation that is part of Otago University's Wellington campus. The name of the organisation is He Kai Oranga, the Housing and Health Program. It's headed up by Professor Philippa Howden-Chapman. This organisation is the gold standard when it comes to matters of housing and public health. They have carried out a pile of world-class public health research on this issue. They have won the public argument and established without any doubt that overcrowding, that poor quality homes are directly attributable to the appalling statistics we have in this country in hospitalisation of children for respiratory diseases. What Philippa Howden-Chapman said to the Select Committee is that the minister's insistence on applying insecurity of tenure to all State House tenants would pose a public health risk. And, sir, I look forward when we debate this bill in more detail to going into the detail of the evidence that the Otago University academics presented to the Select Committee on this issue. Because what they showed us at Select Committee, sir, is that by taking away the security of tenure from some of the most economically and socially vulnerable people in New Zealand, that would pose a public health risk to those people. The second thing that this bill does, sir, is that it enables the transfer of state housing stock to the community housing sector. Labor supports the growing of the community housing sector for all of the reasons that are commonly expressed. However, we oppose the winding down, the cutting back, the depowering of Housing New Zealand, because that is exactly this minister's intention. This bill is a means towards his vision of remaking Housing New Zealand as just another tenancy manager. We may as well get Barfoot and Thompson to manage the state housing stock, sir, because that is this minister's vision, that Housing New Zealand is just another landlord competing in a quasi-contestable market for tenants and subsidies. This minister does not see a future for a strong, capable, government-delivered social housing provider, just as Housing New Zealand is today. Labor does not support that, and we don't believe that growing the community housing sector by chopping up Housing New Zealand into little bits and divvying it out to the NGO sector is the way to do it. Sir, Labor believes that putting a roof over the heads of some of the most vulnerable New Zealanders is a core responsibility of government. In this bill, Nick Smith is stepping away from that responsibility, and we will not be voting for this bill.
I call Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to rise in support of the second reading of the Social Housing Reform Bill, sir.